The haunting at Driftwood Inn. Have you ever stayed somewhere that just didn't feel right? You tell yourself it's your imagination, it's an old building, you're just tired. But what if it wasn't in your head? What if the place itself held secrets, ones that would follow you home? This is the story of Elena Ortiz, a 29-year-old travel nurse who experienced something so chilling she still refuses to talk about it in person. But tonight, you're going to hear it. Elena was on assignment in a small coastal town in Maine. Picturesque, quiet, and isolated. Exactly what she wanted after months of working in a chaotic urban ER. Her agency booked her a month-long stay at the Driftwood Inn, a charming but aging bed and breakfast that had been around since the late 1800s. It wasn't her first choice. Reviews online were mixed, mostly about the inn being outdated. But Elena didn't care. She was looking for peace, not luxury. When she arrived, the place seemed harmless enough. A creaky wooden staircase, antique furniture, and the faint smell of salt water in the air. The owner, an older woman named Martha, was polite but distant, handing her the room key with little more than a curt, "Breakfast is at 7. Elena's room was on the 3rd floor, tucked away at the end of a long hallway. The room itself was quaint, with floral wallpaper and a view of the ocean. But from the moment she stepped inside, something felt off. At first, it was small things. The air felt heavier in her room, like it was harder to breathe. The temperature seemed to drop inexplicably at night, despite the old radiator hissing and clanking. Then, there were the noises. It started with soft tapping coming from the wall behind her bed. At first, Elena thought it was the pipes, but the tapping wasn't random. It had a pattern: 3 quick knocks, a pause, then 3 more. One night, she tried knocking back, laughing at herself for even entertaining the idea. But the moment she did, the knocking stopped, completely. That same night, she woke up around 3 a.m. to the distinct sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud for someone walking on carpet. They stopped right outside her door. Heart pounding, she whispered, "Hello." No response. Summoning her courage, she swung the door open. The hallway was empty, but the air felt icy, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was standing just beyond her sight. The next day, Elena asked Martha if anyone else was staying on the 3rd floor. Martha, without looking up from her crossword, simply said, "You're the only guest this week." That night, Elena decided to keep the lights on as she slept. Around 2:45 a.m., she woke to the sound of whispering. It was faint but unmistakable, like several voices overlapping, too quiet to make out the words. She froze, staring at the ceiling, her breath shallow. The whispers grew louder, circling her bed until they seemed to be coming from right beside her. Terrified, Elena sat up and reached for her phone. As she unlocked it, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The mirror on the dresser across the room. It was angled slightly toward her bed, and in its reflection she saw the faint outline of a figure standing at the foot of her bed. She whipped around, but nothing was there. When she looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. Panicking, she grabbed her things and bolted downstairs, refusing to stay in the room another second. She spent the rest of the night in her car, parked under a streetlight near the shore. The next morning, Elena checked out early, giving Martha a half-hearted excuse about needing to return to work. Martha didn't seem surprised. She just nodded and said, "Not everyone can stay in room 308. Confused, Elena asked what she meant. Martha hesitated before saying, "There's been stories, but it's just an old house. People's minds play tricks on them." Elena didn't press further. She just wanted to leave. But the story doesn't end there. Over the next few weeks, Elena started noticing strange things at home. Lights flickering in her apartment, items moving from where she'd left them, and always, the sound of faint knocking in the dead of night. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 3 more. One night, as she was brushing her teeth, she caught movement in the corner of the bathroom mirror. A dark silhouette standing perfectly still behind her. She spun around, but the room was empty. Elena moved out of that apartment shortly after. To this day, she refuses to stay in hotels or even talk about what happened at the Driftwood Inn. The knocking has stopped, at least for now. So was it all in her head? A byproduct of stress and sleepless nights? Or did something truly follow her home from room 308? One thing's for sure, if you ever find yourself at the Driftwood Inn, you might want to request a room on a different floor, just to be safe. The echoes of Blackwood Library. Have you ever walked into a place and felt like it didn't want you there? Not just an eerie feeling, but a suffocating presence, like the walls themselves were alive with something they weren't telling you. This is the story of Olivia Carter, a graduate student whose simple research trip turned into a chilling experience she's still afraid to talk about. Tonight, we'll walk you through her encounter at the Blackwood Library, a place where history lingers, and not all of it is friendly. Olivia was 27 years old, a history major working on her thesis about the hidden stories of small-town America. Her research brought her to Blackwood, a sleepy town tucked away in the Appalachian foothills. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and time seemed to have stopped decades ago. The centerpiece of the town was its library, a massive stone building with Gothic arches and tall, narrow windows. Built in 1886, it had once been the personal estate of the town's founder, Charles Blackwood, before being converted into a library after his death. Olivia was thrilled. The library was rumored to house records and artifacts unavailable anywhere else. When she contacted the librarian, an older man named Mr. Holloway, he'd agreed to let her access the restricted archives in the basement, a privilege rarely granted. She arrived on a crisp October morning, her breath visible in the air as she climbed the library's steep stone steps. Inside, the place was silent, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. The smell of old books and damp stone hung heavy in the air. Mr. Holloway greeted her with a polite but distant demeanor. He handed her a ring of tarnished keys and explained the rules. The basement archives were off limits after 6 p.m. Never leave any doors open, and if she needed anything, she was to call for him immediately. Olivia thought the rules were odd, but didn't question them. She was eager to dive into the archives. The basement was colder than she expected, and the single overhead light cast long shadows on the stone walls. The records were stored in tall iron shelves that loomed like sentinels, their contents wrapped in dust-covered parchment. Hours passed as she sifted through documents and old journals. Occasionally, she thought she heard faint whispers, but she brushed it off as the sound of her own movements echoing in the cavernous room. Then came the first real incident. Around 5:30 p.m., as she packed up for the day, she noticed something odd. A book she distinctly remembered placing on the table was now back on the shelf. She was sure no one else had come into the room. Confused but not alarmed, she decided she must have been mistaken and left for the evening. That night, Olivia stayed in a nearby bed and breakfast, but her sleep was restless. She dreamed of dark corridors, endless shelves, and the feeling of being watched. At one point, she woke up gasping, her heart racing, though she couldn't remember why. When she returned to the library the next morning, Mr. Holloway seemed unusually pale. He warned her again about the rules, his tone sharper this time. "No exceptions, Miss Carter. None." Olivia assured him she understood and headed back to the basement. The day passed uneventfully until late afternoon. She was engrossed in a collection of personal letters from the Blackwood family when she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. She paused, listening intently. The tapping grew louder, coming from the far corner of the room where the shelves cast deep shadows. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. Summoning her courage, she approached the corner. The tapping stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, as she turned to leave, she felt it, a faint, icy breath against the back of her neck. That evening, Olivia decided to leave her research earlier than usual. She locked the basement door and hurried upstairs, but as she handed the keys back to Mr. Holloway, he frowned. "Did you close the filing cabinet in the third aisle?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, I made sure everything was closed." He stared at her for a moment, then muttered, "Strange," and said no more. That night, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She kept her light on as she worked on her notes, but around midnight, her laptop screen flickered. Then she smelled it, a faint whiff of something metallic, like iron. It reminded her of blood. The smell grew stronger, and then her room went cold. Her breath misted in the air. Before she could react, the shadowy corner of her room seemed to deepen, and from that darkness came a faint whisper, "You shouldn't be here." Terrified, Olivia bolted from the bed and breakfast and spent the rest of the night in her car. The next morning, she returned to the library, determined to finish her research and leave Blackwood for good. Mr. Holloway's warnings now made sense, but Olivia was stubborn. She wasn't going to let a few strange occurrences scare her off. In the basement, she found a journal belonging to Charles Blackwood himself. It was filled with cryptic entries about seances, spirits, and an entity bound to the house. The final entry read, "I have made a grave mistake. It will not let me go, and now I fear it will claim anyone who dares disturb its rest." As she read those words, the overhead light flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. The air grew heavy, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the room. Olivia's pulse raced as she fumbled for her phone, using its flashlight to scan the room. That's when she saw it. At the far end of the aisle, a figure stood shrouded in shadow. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light from her phone. It didn't move, but Olivia felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the figure were daring her to run. She didn't need another invitation. Olivia abandoned her research, sprinted upstairs, and practically threw the keys at Mr. Holloway. He didn't ask what happened. His solemn expression told her he already knew. She left Blackwood that day and never looked back, but the experience stayed with her. For months, she would wake up to the faint smell of iron or feel a sudden chill in the air. Once, she swore she saw a shadow move across her living room, though no one else was there. Even now, years later, she refuses to talk about what she saw in the basement of Blackwood Library. But those who've researched the place since claim that whatever haunts the library isn't bound to its walls. It clings to its visitors, following them, reminding them that some histories aren't meant to be uncovered. So, was Olivia just imagining things? Or did she disturb something that had been waiting in the dark for far too long? One thing's for sure. If you ever find yourself at the Blackwood Library, think twice before venturing into the basement. Some doors are meant to stay closed. The shadows of Cedar Lane. What would you do if you felt like you weren't alone in your own home? Not just the feeling of being watched, but something real. Something you could hear, smell, even sense. This is the story of Carter James, a man whose quiet life was forever changed by a single week on Cedar Lane. Carter was 34 years old, a graphic designer who worked remotely, and he just moved into a small rental house in the suburbs of Philadelphia. It wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, creaky floors, and an overgrown backyard, but it was his. The landlord had been eager to rent it out and even knocked a couple hundred off the monthly price. Carter chalked it up to the house being old and not exactly in pristine condition. At first, things were fine. The house was quiet, almost too quiet compared to his old apartment in the city. The first night, he noticed the faint smell of lavender in the air. It wasn't unpleasant, but it struck him as odd, since the place had been empty for months. He figured it must have been left over from the cleaning products the landlord used. But by the second night, the lavender smell wasn't faint anymore. It was overwhelming, as if someone had spilled an entire bottle of perfume in the living room. That's when the noises started. At first it was subtle, a faint creak in the hallway, a soft tapping sound near the kitchen. Carter brushed it off as the house settling. But then the tapping grew louder, more deliberate. It always seemed to come from the same spot, the corner of the living room where an old wooden rocking chair sat. The landlord had left it behind, saying it was too heavy to bother with. One night, as Carter worked late on his laptop, he heard the chair creak. Not the floorboards, not the walls, the chair itself. It was the unmistakable sound of wood shifting under weight. Carter stared at it, heart pounding, but it didn't move. Not then. The next morning, he pushed the chair into the garage, thinking that would solve the problem. It didn't. That night, Carter woke around 2:30 a.m. to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. His first thought was that someone had broken in. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept by his bed and crept toward the door, his breath shallow. But when he stepped into the hallway, it was empty. Still, the air felt wrong. It was colder than usual, and the lavender smell was back, stronger than ever. As Carter turned to head back to bed, he froze. There, at the far end of the hallway, was a shadow, tall, featureless, and still as a statue. He blinked, and it was gone. The next day, Carter called the landlord, trying to keep his voice calm as he asked if the house had any quirks he should know about. The landlord hesitated before saying, "Some tenants complained about noises, but it's just an old house." Carter didn't push further, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the landlord knew more than he was letting on. That evening, Carter decided to leave every light in the house on. He even kept the TV playing in the background to drown out the silence. But around 3 a.m., the TV shut off on its own. The lights flickered and dimmed until only the lamp in the corner of the room remained on. And then he heard it. A whisper, soft and garbled at first like a distant radio signal, but it grew louder, clearer. "Get out." Carter tried to convince himself he was dreaming. Sleep paralysis, maybe. But when the lamp in the corner toppled over, he knew this was real. He grabbed his car keys and bolted outside, not even bothering to lock the door behind him. He spent the night in his car, parked down the street, engine running, just in case he needed to drive away. The next day, Carter contacted a local historian to see if there was anything unusual about the house. She told him the property had once belonged to a widow named Evelyn Whitaker, who was known for her lavender perfume. She'd lived there alone after her husband's death and had reportedly died in the living room chair, the same one Carter had moved to the garage. That was all Carter needed to hear. He packed up and left that weekend, breaking the lease and forfeiting his deposit. He didn't care. But the story doesn't end there. Months later, Carter was visiting his sister in Chicago when he noticed something strange: the lavender smell. It wasn't as strong as before, but it was there, unmistakable. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard the soft creak of a rocking chair, though there wasn't one in the room. To this day, Carter refuses to talk about the house on Cedar Lane. But if you ask him why he left, he'll simply say, "Some things you can't leave behind, no matter how far you run." Is it possible for a place to leave its mark on someone? Or does something darker follow those who trespass where they're not welcome? Thanks for watching. If you've ever had an experience like Carter's, share your story in the comments. The Haunting of Alderbrook Cabin. Imagine taking a weekend trip to escape the stress of everyday life. No emails, no noise, just peace and quiet. But what if that quiet wasn't empty? What if instead it was full of something watching, waiting? This is the story of Rachel Henderson, a 31-year-old accountant whose relaxing cabin getaway turned into a harrowing encounter she still struggles to explain. Rachel had been working 60-hour weeks, burning out fast. Her friend Claire suggested a weekend trip to Alderbrook, a secluded area in the Pacific Northwest, known for its hiking trails and cozy rental cabins. "It'll be perfect," Claire said. "Just you, nature, and a glass of wine by the fire." Rachel loved the idea. She booked a small cabin, nestled deep in the woods, far from any neighbors. It was a last-minute deal, too good to pass up. The photos showed a rustic but charming one-bedroom cabin with a fireplace and large windows overlooking a dense forest. She arrived on a rainy Friday evening. The drive was long, and the winding mountain roads were shrouded in fog. By the time she pulled up to the cabin, it was nearly dark. The place was smaller than she expected, and the air around it felt still, unnervingly quiet. But she shrugged it off as nerves from being alone in an unfamiliar place. The inside of the cabin was as advertised, cozy and clean, with a faint smell of pine wood and damp earth. Rachel unpacked her bag, made herself a cup of tea, and settled onto the couch with her laptop. That's when she noticed the first strange detail. The windows facing the forest had heavy blackout curtains drawn tightly shut. She found it odd. They weren't pictured in the listing photos. Curious, she pulled one of them aside. The trees outside were impossibly dark, their branches swaying in the wind. But something about the scene unsettled her, and she let the curtain fall back into place. The first night passed without much incident. Rachel dozed off on the couch to the sound of rain against the roof. She woke around 2 a.m. to a strange noise. It sounded like footsteps on the wooden porch outside. Still half asleep, she froze, her heart racing. She held her breath, straining to hear over the rain, moving across the length of the porch. She grabbed her phone and checked the time. No messages. No service. "Hello?" she called out hesitantly. The footsteps stopped. She waited for what felt like an eternity, but nothing happened. Eventually, she convinced herself it was an animal and went back to sleep. The next morning, the porch was slick with rain, but there were no footprints, human or otherwise. Rachel spent the day hiking a nearby trail and trying to shake off the unease from the night before. By the time she returned, the rain had stopped, and the cabin felt warmer, more inviting. She made dinner, poured herself a glass of wine, and settled in by the fireplace with a book. But as the evening wore on, the feeling of being watched crept back in. It was subtle at first, a prickling at the back of her neck, the sense that the shadows in the room weren't entirely still. Around 10 p.m., she heard it again. Footsteps. But this time, they were inside the cabin. Rachel's blood ran cold. The sound came from the small hallway leading to the bedroom. She stood, gripping her phone tightly, and called out, "Who's there?" Silence. She took a tentative step toward the hallway, her heart pounding. Just as she reached the doorway, the overhead light flickered, casting brief shadows that seemed to move on their own. The air grew icy, and she smelled something faint but unmistakable, earthy, like wet soil. Summoning her courage, Rachel stepped into the hallway. Her hand trembled as she reached for the bedroom door, pushing it open. The room was empty. She checked the bathroom and closet, nothing. She was alone, or so she thought. As she turned to leave, she caught something in her peripheral vision, a figure standing just beyond the window outside, motionless. Her breath hitched. It was tall and dark, with no discernible features. She couldn't even tell if it was facing her. Rachel stumbled backward, her heart racing. But when she blinked, the figure was gone. That night, Rachel locked herself in the bedroom, every light in the cabin turned on. Sleep was impossible. Around 3 a.m., she heard a loud bang. It came from the kitchen. Trembling, she cracked the bedroom door open. The kitchen light was off, though she distinctly remembered leaving it on. As she stepped into the living room, the blackout curtains over the windows began to sway slightly, as though moved by an invisible breeze. Then she saw it again. The figure was inside the cabin, standing by the fireplace. This time its form was clearer. It looked human but distorted, its features blurred like a smudged painting. Rachel couldn't move. She could only watch as the figure tilted its head slowly, as if studying her. Finally, it took a single step toward her. That was enough to snap her out of her paralysis. She turned and bolted for the front door, fumbling with the lock. As she swung the door open, she felt an icy hand graze her shoulder. She screamed and ran into the night, not stopping until she reached her car. Rachel drove straight back to the city, arriving just after sunrise. She never returned to the cabin. A week later, the rental agency called, asking why she'd left in such a hurry. She told them the place was haunted. The agent paused before replying, "You're not the first to say that." Apparently, Alderbrook cabin had a history. Decades earlier, a recluse named Thomas Grayson had lived there. He was rumored to have gone mad, spending his days staring out the windows at the forest. One night, he vanished without a trace. To this day, Rachel avoids the woods. She keeps her curtains drawn at night and refuses to stay anywhere without cell service. But every now and then, when she's alone, she feels it again. That sense of being watched. Some things, she says, don't stay behind. So, was it the ghost of Thomas Grayson, or something older, tied to the land itself? We may never know. What we do know is this: not every getaway brings peace, and sometimes the quietest places hide the loudest secrets. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling stories.